Now, one thing that is characteristic of all energies whatsoever, all patterning whatsoever, is that we find it convenient to think about it in terms of the spectrum. So there is a spectrum of light, the visible spectrum running from red to violet, and beyond the visible spectrum there is a very big invisible spectrum, because our eyes respond only to a small section of the measurable spectrum of light. So we have infrared rays at one end and ultraviolet at the other, and then so on out to cosmic rays, gamma rays, hard X-rays, all sorts of things on the invisible bands of the spectrum. So in exactly the same way, there is a spectrum of sound. And if anybody was a sufficient scientist of cookery, they would devise a spectrum of taste. There are certainly spectra of other kinds of vibration than sound and light. And there are likewise conceivable spectra of shapes, spectra of emotions. So we could talk too of a spectrum of love, ranging at the red end from lust or the Freudian libido to divine love at the violet end, divine charity. And in the middle greens would be things like friendship and endearment, and so on. Each emotion, as a matter of fact, could be thought of as having its own spectrum. Now then, the curious thing about the world is that it's a kind of interlocking of spectra, of which the best analogy would be weaving. The interesting thing about weaving is that you've got the two groups of cross threads which give you the pattern, the warp and the woof. And if you pull out either one, there is no pattern, nor is there any cloth. It all falls apart. It needs both the warp and the woof for there to be any pattern at all. And they together constitute the cloth. Now let's look at a similar illustration in the ordinary everyday world of this interlocking of patterns. Let's take the photograph of a face in a newspaper. If you examine this photograph under a magnifying glass, or even with the naked eye, you will easily see that it isn't a continuous face, as faces are supposed to be, but it is a whole collection of dots. Some are heavy, some are light. And according to the heaviness and lightness, as you stand back, you get, as it were, the illusion of there being present, in terms of those dots, a human face. Now let me pose the question. What is the relationship between the form of the face and the gridwork of dots? At first sight, there doesn't seem to be any relationship between them at all, because the printer uses exactly the same kind of screen with which this process is done for any face whatsoever. So the kind of screen he uses makes no difference at all to whose face it is. Anybody's face can be on it, or any other shape. So you might say the fact that he is using a grid is completely irrelevant to the form of the face. Take still another illustration, the radio. When you turn on your radio and it comes on first thing in the morning, the announcer does not say, "The sounds you are now hearing are vibrations of a diaphragm activated by electromagnetism. This is mediated to you through a network of transistors and a broadcasting station with such and such features." He just does not intrude the mechanics of radio. He comes right on saying, "This is station so-and-so, welcome, this is this morning's news," or whatever he begins with. So it would seem that the structure of the radio, the wiring, the transistors, the speaker, have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the message that's coming across it. They are in two different worlds altogether, so it would seem. Then take another possibility. What about the brain? Is thought, emotion, or consciousness itself a function of the brain? If we knew a great deal about the anatomy of the brain, would that tell us a great deal about the patterns of human thinking? Or would it tell us as little about the patterns of human thinking as knowledge of radio engineering tells you about the technique of Bach, whom you hear over the radio? See, there's a real puzzle. And this is one of the interesting subjects brought out in this extraordinary book called Understanding Media by Marshall McLuhan. And I don't think he's clearly answered it, because he is trying to say that what is most important is not so much the message or what is supposed to be the content of any method of extending our nervous system, such as radio, such as television, such as printing, such as photography. He is trying to say that the message is the medium. That is to say, you are influenced by television, not so much by the advertising and all the goop that comes across on it, but by the fact of being in touch with the world through this particular electronic system with all its peculiarities. It's a very interesting idea, and he's put up an argument for it, but I'm not convinced that his argument is quite solid. But I want to go into this question, because obviously you would not hear any music except you had an orchestra in your room, were it not for your radio or your phonograph. And as a matter of fact, even if you had an orchestra in your room, you wouldn't get them to produce any music without those instruments. Now, let me ask the question in another way. What is the relationship between the piano and what you play on it? Any? You can play anything practically on a piano, and the structure of the piano doesn't make any difference. And yet without it you couldn't play. So we've never seen anybody thinking without a brain. So what is the relationship between them? Well, again, you see, it's rather like warp and woof. The warp goes one way and the woof goes the other. But by the interlocking of the two, you get something. So what you've got then are spectra of different kinds. See, when you dial and you move the dial, what you're doing is you're changing the wavelength of your radio. That is to say, you are moving from one end of the spectrum of waves slowly to the other. So the spectrum of radio meshes with another spectrum which is being used in the production of music. As a matter of fact, the production of music is an interlocking of many spectra, but we won't go into that because the emotional spectra are involved. Spectra of speed, of dexterity, of harmonics, all kinds of things go into this. So you get the picture of the world as an enormous web, where spectra mesh with spectra of all kinds, and they're all mutually interdependent, and through them it all hangs together. And the peculiar fact of these spectra is that they come into being together almost. The world is not, you don't see things appearing in nature except from with certain insects and birds that actually practice weaving. But you don't see plants and trees being exactly woven. What seems to happen more than that is that warp and woof come into being together at the same time, in rather the same way that back and front necessarily come into being together at the same time. Or head and tail. You don't see a creature born as a head and then later developing a neck, a trunk, feet, and tail. It just doesn't work that way. It comes in together, head and tail. Even the spermatozoon has a head and a tail.